Well, good evening, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Vigneault. I'm the Executive Director of the Council for Anglophone Magdalen Islanders, CAMI. We're a nonprofit organization based in the Magdalen Islands, working for the English-speaking community. And part of our raison d'être, if you wish, is to preserve our culture. So tonight, I'm very happy and proud to be able to host the writer and director of the documentary, What We Choose to Remember, Guy Rodgers, who came to us from Montreal, who's going to screen his documentary, and then it'll be followed by conversation and questions and answers if you want a question. I'd like to welcome everyone online as well, as in person. And also, and not least, our technical team, Glenn and Paul, who's setting us up with the live streaming. So without further ado, Glenn will take the mic. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Good evening, everyone, online and in person. It's great to be here on the Magdalen Islands. My name's Glenn Patterson from the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. We're a provincial organization that supports smaller community heritage groups like CAMI. And this is our first time on the island, so thanks for the warm welcome, Mike and the CAMI team, all you did to make this happen. As well as there's some other people involved, the Bonfire Media crew out in New Carlisle for helping organize all this. So we're doing a project to mentor heritage groups in doing these sorts of live broadcasts, working with cameras, working with audio gear, recording, all that stuff. So we did 2 workshops, one last night with CAMI's new communications person, Geneviève Audet, who's our sound person tonight now. So you don't hear any sound in the room because this microphone is just for the live stream. And we have Geneviève monitoring the audio and making sure everything sounds good. So thank you, Geneviève. Welcome to the team, to our team and CAMI as well, because she's new here. So what else did I want to say about that? Oh, we have to thank our funders, Canadian Heritage, who supported this project. So we've been traveling all over the province doing these workshops. At QAHN, we are a membership-based organization. It's usually $30 to join for a year. It comes with we have a quarterly publication. It's called Quebec Heritage News. It comes with a subscription. If you're an organization or an individual, you can become a member. Anyone who's here in person, these are free tonight, even though it says $10 on the cover. For people here online or in person, if you want to become a new member tonight, we're offering a 30% discount, so $20 for the whole year. And this usually 4 copies of the magazine. This year there's going to be 5. It's a special edition coming out. So let's see that. I think that's about all I have to say. I want to welcome Guy Rodgers now. Guy, why don't you open it up?
Good. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Glenn. So I don't want to say a whole lot about the film before, but I do hope we can have a discussion about Quebec after. I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions about the film, but I'm also very interested in knowing about your own experiences living in Quebec and how you're feeling about the current climate. Since I released this film in April last year, this is the 35th screening. So I've been traveling all around Quebec. It's been fascinating to talk to different communities. The film was made because of funding from the Secrétariat for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers. And when they were founded, they surveyed Anglophones all around Quebec and found, to nobody's great surprise, that Anglos do not have a strong sense of belonging in Quebec. And they do not have a strong sense of identity. So the Secretariat wanted to fund some projects dealing with questions of identity and belonging. And I have a background in filmmaking, so it seemed to me that a documentary film could be a very interesting way of telling the story. So my goals with making the film were threefold. The first was that 2020 was the 50th anniversary of the FLQ crisis. And I realized that the people who were eyewitnesses to those really politically significant events were still alive and well, and it was a great opportunity to interview them while they're still alive and well. My second reason for making the film was that I was not born in Quebec, but I've lived here for more than 40 years. And I've studied the history, I've studied the people, and I've been impressed by how hard the English-speaking community has adapted to the sort of spirit of Bill 101. And I wanted to make a film that testifies to that community, to those communities, to the diversity and the complexity of the communities. And the third reason that I wanted to make the film was because Anglos are not always fully understood or appreciated by our Francophone neighbors. So I hope that a film could be a way of entering into a really interesting discussion about the history of Quebec and its very citizens, and how we might be able to collaborate together in a positive way to continue building a future for our country and for our children. So those were my goals in making the film. I'm going to say nothing more about it for now, so enjoy the film, and when I come back we can talk about the film if you want, but also I'm really interested in hearing about your experiences. So thank you. Can you identify this flag?
It's like vaguely familiar, but
Est-ce que vous connaissez ce drapeau-là?
Non, pas vraiment. Oui, je l'ai vu pendant mes cours d'histoire.
Et alors, c'est quoi?
Je me rappelle pas. Est-ce que c'est... Non, je sais pas.
definitely something to do with Quebec because of the symbols. Let's go city of Montreal.
C'est le drapeau de Montréal?
Do you know what the 5 floral emblems represent?
No idea, sorry.
Can you identify this flag?
It's like vaguely familiar, but
Est-ce que vous connaissez ce drapeau-là?
Non, pas vraiment. Oui, je l'ai vu pendant mes cours d'histoire.
Et alors, c'est quoi?
Je me rappelle pas. Est-ce que c'est... Non, je sais pas.
definitely something to do with Quebec because of the symbols. So let's go city of Montreal.
C'est le drapeau de Montréal?
Do you know what the 5 floral emblems represent?
No idea, sorry. Oui, ben il y a la fleur de lys.
Oui. Qui représente?
Ben c'est la nation québécoise. Dans le fond, ça représente le Québec, les origines françaises.
Je sais que c'est le Québec, celui-là. Les autres, non, pas vraiment.
Je reconnais les en bas, c'est irlandaise.
The clover probably Irish, and then the rest I would have no idea.
Et puis dans le milieu, c'est pour le peuple autochtone, c'est le pain.
Can you identify the rose or the thistle?
Puis en bas à gauche,
So the fleur-de-lis is for Quebec. The one below is, I believe, a thistle for maybe Scotland, Scottish heritage.
Any idea what country is represented by the rose?
Is that the Yorkshire rose? I'm from Yorkshire.
Montreal is one of the largest French-speaking cities in the world. So why do 3 of the 5 floral emblems represent English-speaking countries?
My family's part of the original Irish to come in 300 years ago in Gaspé. So with the situations out there and with the English after the war, people came in and essentially built, in quotes, air quotes, the city. So I would see that's why they would honor those communities.
Ben, la colonisation des Anglais, là. Donc j'imagine que c'est pour ça.
quoi, le 3 des 5 représentent des pays anglophones? Yeah boy.
Ah, ça, j'en ai aucune idée.
Le motto du Québec, c'est « Je me souviens ». D'après vous, ça nous appelle à se souvenir de quoi?
C'est une question que je me demande, je voudrais bien... Non, je ne sais pas vraiment.
De se souvenir de l'histoire et de ce qui s'est passé, et puis de ne pas oublier.
C'est un peu contradictoire, là. C'est différent pour tout le monde, là.
Je me souviens de ma langue, d'où je viens, de mes valeurs.
Moi, si je peux dire, je me souviens de l'hiver. L'hiver de Québec.
Ça devrait être un bon souvenir. C'est ça comme une nouvelle terre pour les immigrants.
Like the people, like so many different people are here now in Montreal. We used to see, like from many countries. Yeah, and it's a beautiful place.
1812. Taken any history class every year is like Quebec, 1812.
La Deuxième Guerre mondiale, les soldats. Je ne sais pas si c'est le débarquement de Normandie.
It's something to do with the war.
The war? Which war?
I don't know.
Tous les combats qu'il y a eu au niveau de... Lorsqu'on a essayé quand on a essayé de se séparer que la bataille des Patriotes, je pense que je me souviens, ça veut dire je me souviens des batailles qu'on a faites.
Most Montrealers do not know the history represented by the flag of their own city. This is odd in a land whose motto declares the importance of remembering. The inhabitants of Montreal do remember that it was once part of Nouvelle-France. The French-speaking population of the territory was outnumbered by the English speakers of British North America, 70,000 to 1,600,000. You can see the problem for the outnumbered minority. And then English-speaking immigrants began to flood into the territory, while immigration from France almost completely ceased. By the mid-1800s, the rapidly growing English-speaking population of Montreal had passed 50%. The future appeared predictable and inevitable. Fast forward to today. Fortune-telling is not an exact science. The percentage of Quebecers whose mother tongue is English has fallen to 9%. You might think that fears of Anglo domination are now history. You would be wrong. Quebec is still surrounded by an immense ocean of English speakers, and English has become the global language of business, politics, and culture. The English-speaking community of Quebec, although reduced in number, has an important story to tell. For this project, we interviewed people in groups based upon waves of immigration. We are about to meet members of some of the older English-speaking families in Quebec. They have participated in periods of extraordinary growth and development, yet their story is barely included in the official history of Quebec. History is ephemeral and dependent upon what we choose to remember.
On my mother's side, my mother's name was Parkinson, and her grandfather, he came from Lancashire, and he arrived in the 1820s approximately in Rawdon.
My ancestor Frank Johnson, he wanted to be an actor, but his grandfather said, because you like to travel, I'm going to pay your way around the world for as long as you want. So he sailed around the world for 2 years before setting foot on land. And then he came to Quebec and settled on Nickel Road up in Lennoxville, up on a hill, and he started a farm. In his biography, he said on the long winter nights of Lower Canada, that's when he would write his poetry. I have all his books of poetry. He was an adventurer.
When my ancestors arrived, there was roughly an equal number of English and French in Montreal. They came because Montreal was a booming city. There were a lot of Irish people here already.
I think as to why they chose Montreal, Montreal was a massive fixture in Canada at the time, and it had both a large English community and a large French community.
And I know that church was the center of the Scottish community for those years. I also think that as farmers, they interacted a lot, the different farmers in the different rows. I think they traded ideas about crops and techniques and so forth. My original ancestor in the early part of the 19th century that I have some description of, I think interacted a lot with Francophone neighbors who owned different farms. This is what's now NDG.
Now, when we lived on Rang Saint-Remy, our neighbors was Assim Living on one side and Emilien Laniel on the other side. And me and my sisters and brother used to help the Laniel family pick their vegetables, wrap them in bundles, because the Laniel family had to get all these vegetables onto the back of their truck and at Atwater Market for 5 o'clock in the morning. So with these kids, we learned French.
My grandparents, bilingual. There was a lot of exchange early on between the French-speaking communities and the English-speaking communities, and that's sort of just been passed down. Sometimes I wonder, though, if my grandparents and my great aunts and uncles know more French than I do, or maybe they're just more comfortable with it because it was just to get by. They worked on the farm together. They spoke English and French between each other. There was no politics or anything, and sometimes I'm not sure that I always feel that sort of comfort when I speak in my second language.
My grandmother surprised me by speaking French. She was, as I mentioned, an Irish working class Catholic girl, but she grew up in a popular community, as you say, and learned it from her friends and neighbors. So there was access to learning French if you were out there playing on the streets. In the case of my own parents, my mother is French Canadian and my father is Irish, but they had Catholicism and working in the same place to bring them together. So in fact, the frictions, from what I understand, were relatively low.
The street I lived on High Street, and when I was growing up, there were no French families there. As I got a little older, there was a family by the name of Giroux. They spoke English, and the father spoke English, the children spoke, and they went to English school.
I know one anecdote from, I guess this would be maybe the 1920s, of a great aunt who famously was trying to communicate with one of the same neighbor families, I guess, Francophone neighbor families, urgently trying to prepare a probably Christmas dinner or something, and said, "Avez-vous le stale bread pour stuffer le turkey?" That was, that's the kind of lack of integration that took place. So they were trying, I guess, but.
It's really changed during my lifetime. Growing up in the Montreal I grew up in, it was quite possible to continue in the English language and never touch the French language except for peripherally.
I'm probably the last generation of what we call endogamous families, where you married or your family was within the same community linguistic group. And so my parents, both Anglophone, and a great number of my generation were the same thing. And so it was rarer that you would have a parent from the French community.
So if I look back on what my grandparents told me when they were young and growing up, they only spoke English, they only had to speak English. Much like Charles said, the English community married within the English community and the French within the French. And if you knew a few words of French, that was great. And if the French people knew a few words of English, that was fine.
One of these weird things about some aspect of the Protestant school system back in the 50s, they hired a whole lot of Scots out of Scotland. I had teachers, if you spoke to them in English, they had very thick Scottish accents, but they were teaching French. And what was much more interesting, I had a number of teachers from the Middle East, from North Africa. So it was an interesting, broad experience. I even spent a year with an almost entirely Francophone Jewish teachers. But only in my very last year of high school was there a French Catholic substitute teacher. And I emphasize Catholic because that was the reason why they couldn't teach in the Protestant school system. And we had an amazing day because she spent the whole time talking to us about joie. And we didn't know that there was a world out there that sounded that different from what we'd learned in school. So yeah, I think that says a lot about again, the two solitudes.
To combat waves of English-speaking immigration and the lack of French immigration, old stock descendants of Nouvelle-France developed a strategy known as La Revanche des Berceaux, the revenge of the cradles. The unintended consequence was that small farms could not support large families. So many young people were forced to relocate to cities. Montreal, where English speakers controlled most of the business, was notorious for its starvation wages and squalid slums. Uneducated laborers were routinely exploited. French speakers from rural Quebec and the Irish, who fled famines and poverty, were mostly Catholic. They encountered bigotry from Protestants, and they retaliated in kind. The history of Quebec can only be understood through the dual lens of religion and language. It can be difficult for modern secularists to appreciate the hostility that religion created before the 20th century. These simmering tensions exploded when large numbers of immigrants arrived in Quebec speaking neither French nor English. And many were not Catholic or Protestant. This new group, called allophones, would outnumber the English-speaking minority in Montreal by 1981. The burning question was, would these new migrants integrate with Quebec's French-speaking majority or with the minority, because English was the dominant language of North America?
My parents left Italy after the end of the Second World War. The country was ravaged economically, very unstable politically.
Well, Hungary was in the middle of an uprising in '56.
My mother was fleeing from the Cultural Revolution in China.
My parents decided to immigrate in '67 so that my brothers would avoid the army.
Well, the first few years of being in Canada, I lived in the West Island. And in 1967, it really was Anglo-land.
We came to Montreal because my mother had a distant cousin who lived here. And also, both my parents had good Polish educations. My mother's French was impeccable.
On my mother's side, I think it was because she had an older sister who was here. And overall, what Mom talks about is the fact that there were so few people of color anyway. And Montreal was one of the cities that had them. I think that's one of the reasons both of them chose Montreal in the end.
I think most of us have the same experience who immigrated in the 60s. There was no social services to help immigrants or that we were aware of. My father started as a dishwasher and coming from well-educated in Portugal, and that's what you did to survive. My mother, from being a homemaker, started working in a factory.
We came from a country where neither English nor French was the first language. I, as a child, ended up being an informal translator for my parents. And I guess economic, just because, just to put food on the table, The reason why you get into restaurant is that even if the business isn't doing good, at least you're assured food on the table.
Because as with a lot of immigrants who were coming in as refugees or fleeing hardship, they didn't really have much in their pocket, so they built that up from nothing.
My great-grandfather went to work when he first arrived in a factory, and there was a factory fire. The doors were locked, and he was killed. And my grandfather became the man of the house and started working at the age of 12. Well, my grandfather went to work as a teenager to support his family with a horse and wagon, and he went across the Quebec countryside as a peddler. And at that time, there were a lot of Jewish people doing the same thing, a lot of Jewish men, and they were called les Juifs. And it wasn't anti-Semitic. It was just you need a pot and pan, you get it from les Juifs. And he felt very close to his customers. He spoke only French. His English was very poor. But his children were not allowed to be educated in French because as Jews, we were barred from the Catholic schools. Even though by law, they were supposed to allow children of other religions in the schools, they didn't. So all the Jewish kids end up going to Protestant school if they went to public school.
Grandparents spoke perfect French, perfect Moroccan French, not Quebecois French.
they came here, and then it was a product of the government policies that we ended up speaking English. My grandparents had to learn English. There was no English in their household. They spoke French, and they spoke French to my parents. But my parents then, my dad went to an English school. And even beyond that, many people have been speaking about it, how the Catholic school system wouldn't take the Jews, so the Protestant school system would take the Jews.
When my grandparents, my father arrived, he was 7, just about 8 years old. And at that point, there was absolutely no Bill 101. He was an immigrant and he was Jewish. There was no way that he would be accepted in the Francophone schools. It was just not done, period. So he wound up going to one of the Protestant schools, which wound up being a very Jewish school, Baron Bing. Which doesn't exist anymore, but a lot of Jews from around his age range, Baron Bing, I know this, that, and so a lot of the Jewish population around that time went to Baron Bing.
As you know, the Catholic schools, even though both my parents spoke perfect French, would not take us because they didn't want refugees to corrupt their pour laine Québécois, which we would have done, because my father was on the left, so yeah. They were right about that.
I want to say that I always found it interesting that in Montreal, there were the French Canadians who were Catholic. There were all the immigrants who were not, like Jewish people, Greek Orthodox, who wound up at the Protestant school board. And then there were the non-Francophone Catholics, like the Italians, who didn't really have a spot. So we ended up with the English sector of the Montreal Catholic School Commission. Why this happened, and I think Quebec is still in denial about this.
Coming from China, we had no option. That's the government policy. We weren't Catholic, we weren't Protestant, but it was the Protestant system that accepted us.
Anecdotally, I think it's well understood that Québécois did turn away a lot of immigrant kids from their schools back in the 40s and 50s and even into the early 60s. There was one segment of Quebec society that wanted to preserve the purity of French, the French language, the French culture. There was another segment that said, no, we want to welcome and accept and integrate and assimilate non-Québécois, non-Francophones, non-French Canadians, for that matter, at that time. And so these two dichotomies were at war for many, many years, from the 40s and 50s until about Bill 101, 1976.
As the post-war baby boom came to an end, Quebec's labor force would increasingly depend on immigrants. The French-speaking Catholic school system had created a demographic time bomb by pushing away so many immigrants. If the majority of Quebecers were educated in English and working in English, French culture would soon be overwhelmed and assimilated into oblivion. French speakers felt more than ever like a threatened minority within North America. English speakers began to feel like a threatened minority within Quebec. New immigrants were a vulnerable minority caught in the crossfire of a battle that was not theirs. The unstable, volatile situation exploded between the FLQ violence of the 1960s and the second referendum in 1995.
Well, I remember Soldiers in the Street in 1970, I think that was probably the worst that my parents could imagine things could get.
It's my first year teaching, and of course we did have the bomb threats.
A lot of fear, especially around the FLQ, because of the threat of violence. And I was living in Laval, and it was happening in Montreal, and so there was this sense of being separate from it, but not being able to go, it was, don't go to Montreal.
If I go back to grade 2 or grade 3, I remember being told that I could no longer walk to school. It was an 8 or a 10 block walk because mailboxes were blowing up in our neighborhoods. That was an intense moment of violence.
Robin Spry made a film in 1973 that captures the fear and confusion of that period.
In 1963, extremists turned to violence, marking the birth of Le Front de Libération du Québec, the FLQ. The terrorists choose where Wolfe had thought.
Do you remember how many bombings the FLQ was responsible for between 1963 and 1970?
I was shocked from that film how many there were.
In National Revenue Building, the RCMP headquarters, the Canadian National Railways, the Black Watch Armory, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Queen Victoria Monument.
The FLQ also bombed Eton's, Loyola College, and McGill University. The targets of the bombs were strategically chosen as symbols of foreign domination.
In 7 years, 6 people were killed. But Walter Leja survived a direct blast while trying to defuse a bomb in a mailbox in Westmount.
That guy was the nephew of our next-door neighbor.
You were just 8 or 9 years old when the FLQ started. Did the adults speak to you about the situation to warn you of the danger, or did they try to minimize the fear?
We used to walk to school. It was about maybe half a mile walk from our house to the school. And in that stretch, there were 2 or 3 mailboxes. We were told, just don't go near mailboxes because they were being blown up.
I remember, of course, the famous kidnapping of Cross. That's when I think it affected me. And I remember walking along Dr. Penfield and sometimes on Pine and seeing the guards, the soldiers out, you know.
I remember the tension in the atmosphere and wondering what was going to happen and seeing it in the newspapers every day. But then with Pierre Laporte, it was just sad. He had kids, you know. He was and there was no reason that had to happen.
There was a lot of popular support for the FLQ in their manifesto up until Laporte was killed.
And if you look at the age of the audience, that's interesting too. They're all 20s, you know, teens, 20s. Because I remember talking to a few years after that, I was in Seja, and I was an art student, and I remember talking with a young filmmaker at the time, where she was going out with a friend of mine, and she described what it was like coming into Montreal and going to a department store at the center of downtown, Eton's, and being told that, no, we don't speak French here, and speak to us in a civilized language.
It was a scary time because the conspiracies were abound. Like, once we get separated, all the immigrants will lose their houses, it'll be our houses. That was the kind of thing we heard in the neighborhood. Of course, you know, that kind of conspiracy. So it was scary for my parents, it was scary for me.
Well, I came back to Canada in the 70s from graduate school from Berkeley. And one of the first things I did was vote for René Lévesque because he seemed like the most intelligent person running. And at the time, I hadn't really considered the consequences, which were all the doors shut in my face, regardless of my fluency in French.
And I remember quite clearly when the PQ was elected, the debate amongst Anglophones about whether to vote for good government for the PQ, and then the others saying, well, no, there's going to be this separatist thing that's going to arise, and huge discussions around those kinds of things.
For our family, and I'd probably say, you know, much of the Chinese community, 70s and 80s, sadness. 90s, fear. Fear. 90s, le vote ethnique. Palais du Congrès, that's right next to Chinatown. We had armed police at that time because we were afraid that there was going to be like racial violence.
C'est vrai qu'on a été battu au fond par quoi? Par l'argent puis des votes ethniques, essentiellement. Alors, ça veut dire que la prochaine fois, au lieu d'être 60 ou 61% à voter oui, on sera 63 ou 64 et ça s'ira. C'est tout. Mes amis, c'est raté, mais pas de beaucoup. Non. Puis Puis c'est réussi. C'est réussi sur un plan. On est... Hey, si vous voulez, là, on va cesser de parler des francophones du Québec, voulez-vous? On va parler de nous. À 60%, on a voté pour.
So let's talk a little bit about le vote ethnique.
Yeah. Well,
What did that mean for you?
Well, for me, the vote ethnique was obviously, it hits home very, very much, just because of the fact that it's targeting. It puts a big red target, you know, on our backs, and particularly for you know, for the Chinese community. When we heard this, it's kind of like, oh my God, you know, like we came to Canada, we came to Quebec to escape this, and this is happening here, and especially you know, for my parents who are like you know, first generation, and they started from nothing, and they had sacrificed so much, and restaurants and small businesses, they're the first to suffer, because like they're frontline businesses. Like their windows, are they going to be smashed? You know, is there going to be like, you know, violence and vandalism against them?
It was a tense and frightening time. The yes side was devastated by the loss, yet there was no violent backlash. Democracy prevailed. It was a shining moment in Quebec's history.
Deep down, there really is a, and this is why I've stayed on Quebec, a certain, you know, humanity which exists, in which, you know, people say, no, c'est pas ça là, no, c'est pas ça de Québec, okay? And so, luckily, it was that prevailed.
La vote ethnique et l'argent. And so now it is to a point that when government, and I'm not talking about my relation with the people, I'm talking about the government thing. Because the government thing to me, I think, is very different. It's about power, it's about keeping power and getting elected. And so now whenever any of that group says anything to me about having positive relations with the English community, what I hear in my head is, wow, moi je me souviens aussi, hein? Je me souviens de ce soir-là. Je me souviens que à un moment donné, tu disais que je ne pouvais pas parler français. Et là, maintenant que je te parle en français, tu dis, ah, ton accent, c'est pas assez. T'es pas assez québécois pour nous.
Quebec's second referendum on independence in 1995 was a bitterly contested campaign that divided friends and families. A handful of votes determined the razor-thin result. The vote could easily have gone the other way had militant separatists understood the post-war immigrants better and made them feel included in their sovereigntist vision.
Well, I think the idea that only French Canadians were repressed or suppressed economically, politically. In Canada, every ethnic group was, you know, barred from jobs. My uncle, who graduated top of his class at McGill in physics, it took 2 years to find a job. So as Jews, we're used to being excluded. It doesn't surprise us from every country. It's been our experience. But here in Canada, I think, I should say here in Quebec, I think that it was the way that a lot of people were suppressed here. And it was not only French Canadians.
There's a very prevalent narrative of the rich Anglo, the Anglo boss. There is some truth to that, and my own ancestors who were poor were not bosses, but they definitely benefited on the English-speaking side from the fact that there were bosses who spoke English and that there were businesses operating in English. But what I find is it's too, in the media, in history books, there's too often reference only to the wealthy elite, the 1% of the English speakers, as if they represented everyone. I think that's a heavy burden and it has to go.
What I do see is a perpetuation of the myth of the Francophone as oppressed in Quebec. I think that one has a lot more, is more problematic in the sense that as long as you're seeing yourself as oppressed, you can't see yourself as the oppressor.
During the period known as the Great Darkness, or La Grande Noirceur, as it is known in French, and the Quiet Revolution, French speakers in Quebec had legitimate grounds for grievances. In 1971, economist François Vaillancourt, working at the Université de Montréal, revealed that English speakers earned more than Francophones. A unilingual Anglo earned 10% more than a unilingual Francophone. A bilingual Francophone earned 13% more than a unilingual Francophone. But a bilingual Anglo earned 17% more than a unilingual Francophone. French-speaking Quebecers were outraged by economic inequalities favoring minority English speakers in a province where 80% of the population was Francophone. Quebec governments passed laws to improve the status of the French language relative to English. The aims of the policies were twofold. First, to create equal opportunities for French speakers in their own province. And second, to enshrine French as the language of work and the shared public language of Quebec. One response to the new laws was that hundreds of thousands left Quebec.
The issue or the topic of leaving the city or leaving the province was never really broached. I think that to be uprooted again after, being settled in a new country for 10 or 15 years, 20 years, to, pick up your bags and leave again and go where? If you're going to be uprooted every time that something, unhappy or unwelcome happens, well, you might as well just, live on a boat and, or live in a mobile home.
Chinese immigrants are survivors. We're pragmatic, Those people that could leave, they left. And those people that couldn't leave, they stayed. Many people moved to Ontario, outside of Canada, United States. And that's where the sadness was. Many of my colleagues who I grew up with.
Well, my wife is from the East End of Montreal, and the church we got married in and where the kids got christened is no longer there. It's been bulldozed into the ground because there's no community left. They all moved away. The elementary school that she went to, which had a chemistry lab, which, it was quite a school built by the community, is gone.
That was a big exodus, and I remember part of it coincided with a depression in the economy, and I remember just the feeling of emptiness of closed up shops on St. Catherine Street, and it was also a real switch in Montreal's identity, which had become, it used to be the commercial center of Canada, and that switched to Toronto. In that sense, Montreal lost a lot economically.
Remember that our prime minister is a Quebecer, right? And so for some reason that gave me a sense of safety. And I smile because I still see that night where, the parade and it gets wild and security moves in to take him out and he leans forward and he does the "I'm not going anywhere." I think that shaped my own "I'm not going anywhere." Trudeau said, "No, this is mine." And he said, "It was mine too. And so as long as I'm alive, I'm going to keep that Trudeau spirit."
I think my dad's side of the family was probably more used to it, quote unquote, because they left a country they weren't wanted from before. And as far as the referendum and all that was, well, it's never going to be as bad as what we left. It's just not. And I think that was part of the mentality. They had their roots and they weren't leaving at this point.
My parents were both fairly advanced in their careers. They were both social workers, and they were quite critical of the bureaucracy, which they felt was encompassing their lives in the wake of the Quiet Revolution. But that said, my mother became, and this may have had something to do with our decision to stay, my mother became quite an ardent PQ supporter, and she thought, these people, this was before they were elected in '76, were going in the right direction. So she was very excited about them for quite a long time.
The notion of leaving Quebec never came. We didn't want to uproot again. My parents certainly didn't. This is where we decided to live, and we were just going to stay put. And the funny thing is, like, we had neighbors that were French. We were all friends. We all got along. I think the politics is what brought some animosity between friends and neighbors, and that was unfortunate. And then we realized when we won, I mean, we didn't expect the French not to have their place. This was their province, but to live in harmony. And I think that's what a lot of immigrants want. We don't want to take your place. We don't want to take your jobs. You don't want to take the jobs that we took, like washing dishes or something like that. So, let's live in harmony.
My mom was an American. They were looking to possibly move to Massachusetts. There was this undercurrent of, we have a specific ethnicity, the time for the Québécois to have their own country, and he didn't feel Québécois. So why would you stay in a country that's new, that's uncertain, if you don't feel emotionally attached to it? And so he was perfectly happy to move to Ontario or something like that. It was very easy for him to view himself leaving if things got just that much worse. If the vote had been yes, he would have been gone the next day.
And I called my father up, worried about my mother. And I said, Papa, do you think maybe you'll leave Montreal? He said, why? I said, because of the political unrest. He had a terrific belly laugh. He laughed deeply and long. And he said, Anna, you're calling this political unrest? He thought I was crazy.
So anybody who did stay had in a sense, tacitly or actively agreed to, okay, this is where we live. This is, there's some validity to what's going on. We're going to pay attention to that. We're going to learn French language, and it's going to be a different place.
I came back as soon as I could get out of Toronto and come back to Montreal. As soon as I could find any kind of work here, I came back. And I think that I would have come back even if Quebec had separated. I just didn't feel at home anywhere else.
I love the heartfelt nature of French culture here. Whenever I come back here from a unilingual place, when I start to hear the language, it's just it's a flow which I find thrilling. It's to have that kind of variety in the city where I live.
Bill 101 obliged all immigrants to be educated in French, including English speakers. The new language laws struck many non-Francophones as heavy-handed, but probably a necessary affirmative action to correct past inequalities. Most English speakers who stayed in Quebec chose to learn French as best they could.
Well, I'm very proud that I was one of the first students that was in the French immersion program in the Protestant school system. And unfortunately, it started at age 12, which is a bit late to learn a second or a third language. But my curriculum was accelerated before that so that I could start at grade 7 to have only in French all the basic subjects. And it was an honor. And I never felt like I had to learn French. I wanted to. I was very motivated.
When I came to Montreal, I got a certificate from McGill in French conversation. And then as a teacher, because I was a Canadian history teacher, and because I wanted in the 80s to really improve my French, I went to the University of Montreal and I took a diploma in Quebec studies. All the lectures were in French.
My son was born in '93, my daughter in '96. They went to elementary school in French, and our whole social milieu was Plateau Montreal. And I had to learn a lot more French a lot quickly so I could help them with their math homework and whatever else.
I grew up bilingual. They're very proud of me. I'm referred to as the French kid in the family.
I went to English schools for elementary, high school, CEGEP, and then I made the decision to go to Université de Montréal. And going into Université de Montréal, I'm a kippa-wearing Jew. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get anti-Semitism. This is going to be interesting. I have not heard a single word about me being Jewish. I have gotten so much abuse for being Anglo. I was not expecting that at all. So I said, you know what? Let's try something. I'm going to create the Comité des étudiants anglophones en droit de l'Université de Montréal. And I hear some people speak out about the club, and they say, well, we don't think that U of M should have an Anglophone club. It's a French school. If you want to be Anglo, you go to McGill. And then I had someone else say, if you give the Anglos an inch, they'll take a mile. But then I had people come out and say, you know what? I'm Francophone. My grandmother used to tell me about how they forced her to speak forced her to speak English at the Eaton Center when they were serving people. That happened. Okay, that happened. But now it's different. And this is a service that they need. They're not being political. We should help integrate Anglophones.
I grew up in Quebec City. I did my law, actually. I jumped from the English system directly into the French system at Laval University, where I did my baccalauréat de droit. I sympathize totally with you, Mayor, okay? I was the only Vismin of Laval, and there were a couple of Anglos, refugees from Montreal. But that being said, I made that decision to, immerse myself into French culture, French institutions.
Growing up in the 90s as an Anglophone, it wasn't always amazing. From an Anglophone family that do not speak French, my father tries, but my mom's family don't. There were struggles as a child to not be able to communicate with the other children that were only French. I realized quickly in high school that if I wanted any success within the province, I'm really going to have to study French. And I ended up getting a job within the public where, I was forced to speak French every day, and then trying to become friends with people who were French just to get that language, because it was always for me an embarrassment to have that English accent when I spoke the language, and it's still there today.
Well, you're not alone. A lot of us feel that way. Bill 101 obliged immigrants to be educated in French. But could it create the conditions that would cause them to love Quebec's French language and culture?
When we left Vietnam, we left on the very last day, April 30th, 1975. And my parents, with the 8 kids, they wanted to have a better future for us because they didn't know how it would be with the communists taking over in the South. And so we took off on the very last boat.
Well, I was born in 1977, which was 2 years into the Lebanese Civil War. And by 1982, the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Israeli military were having a war in our neighborhood. So the neighborhood was destroyed and we had nowhere else to go. So we got on a boat and we left.
My family's originally from Cambodia. And my parents, my brother, my grandmother escaped Cambodia due to the Khmer Rouge regime. My mother was pregnant with me. We stopped off in Thailand. My mother gave birth to me. And then we landed on Canadian soil in 1980. We first moved to Ottawa, and then we moved to Montreal in 1986.
We arrived under the auspices that my parents' French proficiency would work out well for them here. My mother was a French teacher, but as an immigrant, no one would give her a job as a French teacher. There were 4 of us living in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment, all on top of each other. I was held back a year in school and put in a classe d'accueil. I felt alienated from everyone around me because my French was really non-existent at that point.
I remember we stayed in this hotel for about a week. My parents and me, my 7 brothers, sisters. I was 8 years old. So obviously, for me, it's like, wow, it's like a new adventure. I've never seen so many white people in my life. And so that was good. But I think it was really hard for my parents because here they are with 8 kids. But as a child, I thought it was hard because we went to those classes d'accueil to make sure that we understood French. And from there, it didn't take long. We started regular school. But I remember being bullied because I didn't know how to speak Québécois. The only French I knew was from the Tintin, right? Saperlipopette, zut alors. And you don't speak like that in the schoolyard because you get beat up really fast. And that's what happened to me. So it was tough to try to speak like them.
Well, the strongest memories were that it was the very first time in my life that I felt profoundly disillusioned in that grown up in all these political situations. We'd moved because of a war and all that, but I felt protected before then, and life had somehow still felt easy when we were in Greece, and then we were moving here to resolve a lot of problems, and it felt like I'd become a problem by the time we ended up here.
Well, during that period, I guess I was in my teenager and in high school. I know that my parents were very concerned because, you know, for them, it's like they don't want, they feel very Canadian, and they always, every time there's a talk about referendum or Quebec separating, it makes them nervous.
It was the first time I felt that politics were actually affecting me directly. I got held back a year. I had to go to special classes. People treated me like a problem that needed to be solved. So all that just led to a lot of anger. It created this chip on my shoulder. It was from like 12 to 14, so I was just getting this sense of getting to know myself.
When I hear about my parents being insecure and anxious, I guess that would affect me because there I was in high school struggling with my own, you know, kind of identity. You don't know anymore. When you're at home, you have to be Vietnamese. When you're at school, you have to speak Québécois to fit in. But then I wanted to go to English university, and I didn't know if I was able to learn English.
The children of new immigrants are obliged to learn French. Many also learn English, and they retain their mother tongue. These multilingual immigrants are perfectly adapted to the emerging global economy.
My choice of Quebec goes all the way back to 1995, where at my last year at university in the UK, I chose to do an option on Quebec. I always knew that I wanted to be able to live in more than one language than just English. So I chose Quebec in the craziest year, of course, the year of the referendum.
We came in 1998, which means that we didn't really have internet yet back at home, so we couldn't research and prepare and find and build that support system as people who immigrate now do. So when we came, we felt quite lost. So everything was confusing, everything was new, everything was daunting. When you're an immigrant, you lose your network, right? They say your network is your net worth. We come to a new country, we become poor instantaneously.
Before I arrived here, I know there was a long, complicated history between the Anglophone and Francophone in Quebec. But in my mind, I thought it was in the past. It's in the history. So I wasn't aware before arriving that they're still existing for political, social, there's still some conflict existing in Quebec. So for me, that was a shock.
Well, I think I was fairly prepared because having studied in Vancouver in high school in the early 90s, I was familiar with the FLQ crisis, to some extent the silent revolution, and also the referendum. And so when I moved to Montreal, I knew that I was walking into a hotbed. And it was still pretty hot when I got here. There was still a lot of resentment against Anglophones. And I think a lot of it that was directed at newcomers, persons of color.
Arriving here, I knew absolutely nothing about it. But my first semester in CEGEP, first class, our teacher said, everybody take out sheets of paper and pen. We're going to have a quiz. We said, quiz, first class, why are we having a quiz? And he said, the question is, what do you think of Bill 101? And everybody started writing, and I raised my hand, and I said, I'm not sure what you're talking about, and you don't know what Bill 101 is, and he seemed to have taken it personally.
If we're talking about the French community or the Anglophone and Francophone, I think if we're still having issues now between these two, group, I found it's kind of a little bit sad because, there's so many immigrants here or from different regions, different background came and contributed in Canada's development, right? There are many, from Italy or from Africa, from Asia, everybody contribute in this country.
It's like there's a war between the French and the English, not just the language, but the communities. And as a visual minority, I'm kind of caught in the crossfire. And so I see things through a very different lens. On a social level, I think it's great. I can jive with both French, English, and many different communities without problems. But where I find the greatest barriers is really when it comes to employment, when it comes to being able to secure stable employment or permanent employment. And it's not just in my particular case, but other visible minorities, indigenous peoples, persons of colors, black peoples, trying to get jobs who are always on the periphery.
One pervasive myth in Quebec is that all Anglos live on the island of Montreal, and that they are hunkered down in wealthy gated communities spreading from the western slopes of Mount Royal to the west side of the island. Therefore, the rural heartland of Quebec is, and always was, 100% French. The census numbers of 1861 tell a surprisingly different story. Quebec was home to many English speakers in almost every region. If we were to travel back in time to the Victorian era, we would discover large numbers of English speakers who helped develop the rural regions of Quebec. These forgotten worlds are still very much alive for the descendants who still live there.
My great-great-grandfather actually has the most interesting story in our family. He himself was born in Finland, in a place that was occupied by Russia at the time. So he had transited through England and was working on this British vessel called the Good Intent that was off the coast of the Magdalen Islands in 1855 in a December gale, and they ran aground. And the rudder broke on the ship, and so he came ashore on a lifeboat, actually hanging on to a lifeboat. And when he got ashore, they repaired the vessel. The vessel went back to England, but he didn't go. He decided to stay.
I was born in Abitibi-Témiscamingue in the city of Rouyn-Noranda. And my grandparents immigrated from Italy on both sides. So they came here, they knew English, they knew Italian, they knew French.
I'm from North Hatley, Quebec, which is in the Eastern Townships. My mother is a fourth-generation English speaker from the townships with Irish, Serbian, and British background. And my father actually is an immigrant from the States, but his parents immigrated from India.
Hi, Shelley. Hi, Catherine.
Hello, everybody. I'd love to be with you, but unfortunately, it's winter on the lower North Shore, and we currently have no ferry service right now.
Hi, everybody. I am currently in Baie-Comeau, and for me to get to Montreal, it would be about an 8-hour drive.
I'm from the Gaspésie. I was born and raised there. We have 2 English elementary schools just within Gaspé itself and an English high school.
We have about 14 communities total. The majority obviously is English, predominantly English speaking. We do have one Francophone community, which is Tête-à-Baleine. We have a bilingual community, which is Lords de Blanc. We also have 2 native reservations in our region. And although the lower North Shore as a whole is very much close-knit, but each community has their own distinctive flavor.
In the Magdalen Islands, there's one municipality that's predominantly English as well. I would say 95% of the population is English speaking.
There's one English church in my region that's still running, actually. My parents are a very big part of it. There's also, there's one high school. There's one English high school.
In the Magdalen Islands, very similar to Rouyn-Noranda. There's one church, well, 2 churches actually, same denomination. One school, English school, high school, and elementary together.
Similar to what everyone else has already said, highest you can do is in English is high school. After that, there is a cégep in Thetford. But if you want to do university, it's either you go to Bishop's in Lennoxville, or you go to Montreal, or you could go to Quebec City.
In order to go, let's say I graduated with 5. We were 5 in total. So to go from having a class of 5 to living in a big city, sometimes it could be a huge challenge. So I know many people, they prefer to go to Lennoxville for that reason because it's still a smaller community than going to Montreal.
Travel is one of our huge challenges. We're not, unfortunately, connected by road, each community. There are some communities like Harrington, who's just an island. We only have one airline, and it's ridiculously expensive. When I travel, say, to Quebec City for meetings, right? We have to leave the day before, obviously, because it takes us all day to travel. Get on the plane to Blanc, fly to Sept-Îles, wait, change planes, and either go to Quebec or Montreal, wherever my meetings is. So the air flight alone could be $2,500. And that's not counting the hotels and the meals and like, for a day meeting, it'll take us 3 days for one day meeting.
Now one of the bigger challenges I've faced back in the townships has been dating. And I think, it's just the pool of like young, eligible, somewhat like-minded people is a lot smaller in the regions than it is in the big cities. And unless you're already in a relationship and you're kind of moving to a region with your partner and your family, a lot of young, single young people are not going to want to move there for fear of never finding anyone that suits them.
Well, I see a lot of nodding heads, so I suspect your experience was not unique.
Plus, everyone in the townships are like related for the most part.
Before I went to high school and I started dating, my mom was like, if you have a crush on anyone, make sure you tell me their name so I can make sure you're not related. I was like, okay. Yes. You run out of Tinder swipes in like 30 swipes. That's it. Like,
one of my cousins dated someone for 3 years, brought them down home. My uncle started talking to him. They found out they were like 7 cousins.
I can't date in the English community. I'm related to everyone. So that French, that English accent was coming out heavy.
So finding work just in general in my region is really easy. We're a mining region. A lot of people just go to the mines, like they'll graduate high school to go to the mines. It's a well-paying job. It's a dangerous job, a well-paying job. In terms of finding work in English, it's very difficult and limited. But if you wanted to go find work in French and be bilingual, it's actually an asset.
My family started and still runs the first Indian restaurant in the Eastern Townships, where forever the staff that they have hired has been a really interesting microcosm of the different kind of populations that are living in the townships that doesn't correspond to a lot of the dominant narratives about what the who townshippers are.
Basically did all of my education in English, and therefore when I got onto the job market, I thought it would be a little challenging because my vocabulary was limited to basically just using it with friends while going shopping. In the beginning, it was actually quite hard. Like, I came home and I was exhausted and I had headaches. But after like 3 months, I remember I was speaking to my boss and she was like, wow, Catherine, like, look at you. 3 months ago, you would have never spoken like that.
And I would say that the quality of the French language education I received in the region was just not up to par to almost help us foster and thrive in that language. That was only, 15 years ago? And I would say the inverse is true as well for my cousins who went to French school. I wouldn't say that the quality of the English language education they got was fantastic either. At that time, it wasn't as well focused on. And now a lot of my former classmates, lots of them who didn't get that chance to learn French in school and they came from Anglophone only families, a lot of them end up leaving the region because they just can't do the work in French. It's not their fault, but with what they grew up with, it's not possible for them to thrive.
It was very important to my parents to send myself and my younger brother to French high school because I think they were very aware of the different limitations that not being fully bilingual kind of created for them in their not only professional lives, but their social lives. And they wanted my brother and I to have every opportunity, so they forced us to go to French high school, which was really a gift in retrospect. At the time, it didn't feel that way. So my brother and I are fully bilingual. My brother went on to pursue all of his med school, all of his studies in French, and ended up marrying a Francophone, and his life really took a different path.
It was really hard growing up in my community as an Anglophone, going to an English school and not even knowing, like some of my French friends, if you will, they didn't even know that there was an English school. And then I was pegged as that English girl. Like, I was that English girl, which is why the accent had to be gone right away.
When you have that accent on your French, it's so obvious. And I wouldn't say it's the majority of cases, but every now and then you'll get someone who criticizes your accent or criticizes the way that you speak. And it hurts. You're like, I'm in my second language. I'm doing my best. Can you recognize that?
English-speaking schools and churches can be found in many regions of Quebec, but they are often invisible. Like the communities they serve, large English-speaking populations have disappeared. Some people got rid of their accents and assimilated almost completely. Others relocated to Montreal or left Quebec. The communities that remain are vestiges of what they once were.
In Baie-Comeau, I wouldn't say that there is necessarily two communities, the English and the French, because I'd say honestly it's because a lot of the French population doesn't even know that there is an English community. They are aware of the history of the town, that it was founded and it was super English in the beginning. The community was extremely Anglophone in the beginning, and I'm actually not sure how it became to be so French with so little English. I think it's basically with the industries, the English families just moved out of town, but I'm actually really not sure about that.
Even I'm starting to realize how much that sort of the old English names for regions are starting to disappear. Even in my mom's generation, some of the traditional names for like some of the hills or the lakes or the rivers, they're gone. And I'm only just starting to retrace them back with the help of like my great uncles, my great aunts, or books that were written in the 1800s about it. And I think that's important. And I think it's really important for my generation, you know, me, my cousins, other people who have connections and roots down home to sort of make sure that history isn't lost and that culture isn't lost. No one in my generation knows how to play the fiddle that I know of. Honestly, I don't know if there'll be another sort of that kind of kitchen party when we can all gather again in the same way. I mean, I still know all the fiddle music, but I can't play it myself type thing.
One of the things that I saw a few years ago, CBC did this map. Where are the Anglos in Quebec? And they have this wonderful interactive map on their website. I don't know if it's still there. But so few people who live in Montreal, for example, believe that there are vibrant English-speaking communities that thrive outside this metropolis.
I work with, a lot of people in the English Montreal School Board. They say, well, why aren't you French? You're from Gaspé. And I'm like, there's a big Anglophone community. We exist.
Oh my God. Literally, that comes up in every job interview.
That's really interesting.
If you're from the Gaspé, why are you English?
In the first half of the 20th century, most of the business signs in downtown Montreal were in English. Even the municipal signs could be unilingually English. It became a source of outrage for the French-speaking majority. Language laws have completely changed the public face of Quebec's cities. Quebec is officially a French-speaking province, although businesses and government agencies still offer services in English. Newcomers are mystified at the passions that can be stirred up by something as simple as the recently reviled greeting, bonjour, hi. Anglos and allophones appreciate the bilingual character of Quebec, particularly in Montreal. They want their children to speak French, but they also want them to speak English and other languages.
So I became a school commissioner and was with a group of young parents who fought to have a bilingual program in the English school, because otherwise the choice was to go to French school. And then, of course, that leads to the demise and the decline and disappearance of the English school system. So I think we've done pretty well, because both my kids, son and a daughter, have stayed here in Quebec and are having their own children now. And they're pretty bilingual. You can never really say that you're fluently bilingual. My son-in-law is what I call a Franglo. You know, he's just unbelievable. You can't tell when he speaks English or French of which linguistic group he's from. So that's always the aim. And I wish there was a bit more flexibility in allowing that bilingualism, because it's a dirty word, right? But I think there would be a lot of advantages for enhanced bilingualism in the educational system.
I feel more a Montrealer than I do a Quebecer or a Canadian. I love the city. I love the people here. I've been involved in the stand-up comedy scene here in Montreal, not professionally, but as a hobby, for about 10 years. And all the comedians perform in both languages easily. As a teacher, all my students were at least 3 languages, French being the primary language of instruction, but able to converse in 2 or 3 other languages besides that. And to me, that's the richness of our city. That's why I love it here.
I have 2 kids. So I have my son, who's 22, and my daughter is 18. It's important for me that they speak as many languages as possible. But I gave up on Vietnamese. So they're bilingual. I think it's important because, like one of my colleagues here, I would love for my kids to stay here in Montreal and Quebec and settle here. But I feel privileged that I was able to send them to English school, because my husband is Canadian, he's from Montreal, Irish, Scottish, Chinese, and so my kids are a little bit of everything. And so because my husband is Anglophone, I was able to send my 2 kids to, French immersion school. And so I'm very proud of that.
I have an 11-year-old, and given the adversity that I had with my schooling system and how it became so formational, I was very aware that we had to have a plan going forward. And so we decided that we were going to put our son in a French school. And it was hard for him for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, but he adjusted pretty quickly. The younger you do it, the easier it is. So he's arrived at a point where he's naturally curious about his Lebanese heritage now. So, he ends up on Skype once a week with his grandmother, and they go through a little lesson.
So I have 4 children, and I remember this was a big debate when my oldest was ready to enter school, because on their grandparents' side, from their father's side, they had placed my now ex-husband in French elementary school when he was growing up, and they insisted that their grandchildren also go to French elementary school. And I was adamant. I said, no, my children are going to go in the English sector. This was after the change, and there were linguistic school boards. They were going in the English sector because English is the international language of business. I have a background in business, and it was so important for them to learn English as their first language and French as their second language.
My ex and I, we sent our daughter to an international French school, a French language school called Collège International de France. My daughter is what you could call a lifer. She's been there from maternelle all the way up to lycée. She followed the French system. In the school, it was fairly strict. You were not allowed to speak other languages aside from French, even during breaks, which is great because during the breaks they would speak English.
My husband grew up here, so he's a French Canadian, and since I'm an immigrant and non-Anglophone background, so I don't have a choice. In our family, when I realized we don't have a choice, we just have to work with the system. I have no problem sending my kids to French school because I think it is harder to learn French compared to English. And I think it's good for them to be in an environment that they can learn French.
As an immigrant and with a Francophone husband, then yes, our son was in French public school, started French. I must say that as an English-speaking parent, I was quite upset when his high school sent a questionnaire, did not ask me what was my language, didn't ask if my son was bilingual. Their questions on whether my son should have access to enriched English at high school were whether he had done immersion in grade 5 and grade 6.
My daughter was very shy about speaking English until I think the equivalent of grade 8. At that time, she did 1 year of intensive English, and she completely changed from being more unilingual to being a bilingual speaker.
But I do believe English is very, very important in nowadays life for everybody. The problem is in public French school, they only allowed you to speak French, no English. So what we do at our home is we speak English at home. And so we keep her English, advancing while she's learning French in school.
It's unacceptable that my son not do enriched English when how he's going to be bored. So I found that a challenge that how could you not assume that maybe a child has an English-speaking parent and wants access to a better level of English?
In the 1970s, Quebec governments were determined to make French the public language. Now, 95% of Quebecers can understand French, but the source of fear has shifted to mother tongue. Anglophones and allophones can learn French, but they cannot change their mother tongue. And they wonder why mother tongue has become an issue. It creates two kinds of Quebecers. One is a private club that only certain people are born into. The other group can never belong, no matter how hard they try to learn French and make a positive contribution to Quebec. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was shocking that Anglos could earn more money than Francophones in this province where they were the majority. Economist François Vaillancourt has continued to track the same Statistics Canada census numbers using the same methodology. The most recent numbers are from 2011. Has the situation changed? The fact that unilingual Anglos now earn 10% less than unilingual Francophones is not surprising after half a century of promoting French as the working language of Quebec's majority population. It might be surprising that Vaillancourt's 2011 data show that bilingual Anglos earned 8% less than unilingual Francophones and 15% less than bilingual Francophones. It is hard to understand why French-speaking allophones earned 36% less than mother tongue Francophones, and allophones who made the effort to learn French and English earned 21% less than unilingual Francophones. Smaller economic inequalities in the 70s provoked violent protests and strong government interventions. These new economic inequalities are not even on the radar for Quebec's policymakers today.
I speak fluent French and have worked in French for over 20 years. And it's not that I haven't been hired by a French company, but I've been interviewed. I have never even been called. Like, I would send my CV to an ordinary French company, and I'd send it to a huge multinational in Montreal, and I'd get called by the huge multinational, but not by the French company. Like, I've lived in France. Why not? How come they don't think I'm going to fit in? I obviously speak the language, and I don't get that.
It's quite incredible. Living here in Quebec, the amount of people who will say to me, oh, you're so lucky that you're of color, because there's all these programs for you. They want to hire, the government wants to hire. You've got it made. And these same people actually wouldn't hire you. And similar to your experience, when I first moved to Montreal, I would apply for jobs in French, send out my French CV, go to job interviews in French, and the replies would often be, well, you speak French very well, but you have an accent, and je pense qu'il faudrait qu'on engage quelqu'un d'ici. We need someone from here that people can understand. So people can talk about language, but really the communication ain't happening.
I was able to navigate in English, en français, and I was proud of that. Now that I'm no longer working in a corporate, now that I've raised my kids, now that I travel the world, now that I'm currently working on a documentary movie, my first one, on Vietnam, on women entrepreneurs, I find that now there's little subtle, for example, my neighbor, so she would ask me, est-ce que tu vas faire le film en français? So I tell her, no, it's going to be in English, because I really want to empower women in the world with my movie. And then we got into a very uncomfortable discussion. Ah ben non, Zuni, voyons donc, t'es au Québec. t'as fait tellement d'entrevues à Radio-Canada, t'es dans les nouvelles, il faut que ça soit en français. And since then, she's not talking to me too much. I feel like I've given a lot to Quebec. I think, you know, I taught immigrants, I teach, I speak to different audiences. I've done a lot of work, but now all of a sudden, il faut que je sois un petit peu plus québécoise que canadienne. And I don't like that.
As far as politics are concerned, I'm actually in the process right now of pursuing in the short, medium term, in the next few years, a political career. So this is something that's been on my agenda that I've done a lot of research in, because there aren't a lot of people who look like me or like Zuni in national or provincial politics. And that doesn't scare me. And I've explained this to my children. I said, when you have a voice and you have something to say and you have a message to send out and you say it and you articulate well, it doesn't matter what you look like, and you just keep pushing.
It's like a party or a dinner, right? When you're in a family, whether you like each other or not, you're at the dinner table and things happen there. But if you're on the outside, you can never sit at the dinner table. So my policy for the last couple of years is really to come uninvited to the table, knock on the door, crash the door down, crash the party, but always make sure that I bring something, right? Like any family or any meal, you've got to bring something that you can contribute, that you can use to enrich that experience.
In the kitchen, in the dining room, there always is some kind of collection of bilingual or unilingual French speakers, English speakers, Afghanistan, people from Nepal, people who, some Indian languages and not others. Race has played a very big role in my life and the formulation of my own identity in Quebec. One of the reasons for that is this kind of assumption that because, if you're a person of color, you can't really be from here.
Interestingly, when I went back to Ukraine to visit after graduating university, I felt that I didn't belong there at all. So all of a sudden, I felt I had a bigger culture shock going there than I had here. And then I felt, oh my God, I don't belong anywhere. So really now, as an adult who is successful and has her own business and has built an incredible community that's extremely supportive, now I belong. I've never called myself a Quebecer. I only thought of this now as we're having this discussion. I don't know why. I say that I'm Canadian. I say that I'm from Canada. Inevitably now, I also always mention that I'm an immigrant, and I didn't for so many years. I would hide it. Now I own T-shirts that say immigrant. I own mugs. My headshots on all of my social media say immigrant on them as well. So now it's this balanced identity. Where do I belong? I belong with my family. I belong with my friends. I belong with my community. But there's still that inescapable feeling of otherness that I have learned to accept.
I love Marina's immigrant t-shirts because I think a lot of us as immigrants, I identify, I see things that Marina says, I see things other immigrants say, and we have made a choice to come here. We're courageous people. This 15-year stretch that I've been living here is the longest I've lived in one place for my life, and I'm nearly 50. So I really, this is home for me. I'm happy that my son has that. I moved all the time as a little girl. I'm so happy that he has that stability. And my husband's very, very Quebecois, and I love Quebecois culture. I can't help but also feel very Canadian.
I've always presented myself as a Chinese, English Quebecer who's fluently, I would have said bilingual, but I speak like 4 different languages, so polyglot, and Canadian. But and it's only like when my mid-20s, when I started traveling outside of Quebec, that I realized to what degree I was a Quebecer. But like Mayor, right? I'm a fighter, I define who I am. I define my identity, I'm a Quebecer, sino-Québécois, right? And in that sense, right, I feel, totally part of Quebec. They might not always feel the same way, but that's their problem.
It's a complicated question. I think that whether you belong or you don't belong is whether you feel you belong. And I never really felt like I don't belong. I mean, sure, I'm the Italian Anglophone with my Francophone friends, and I'm the Italian Anglophone with my Anglophone friends. But that's between you guys, between you Francophones and you Anglophones. I'm not either one.
I do have an incredible amount of empathy and compassion for those who want to preserve the language and for the French speakers who are afraid that they will lose their culture. I absolutely understand that. I come from Ukraine. You know, our language was suppressed. It was prohibited. You were made to feel as a peasant if you were speaking your mother tongue. A lot of things were done. So I understand. I have a lot of appreciation. But I think that there are better approaches to not killing the love for the language that most of us immigrants have when we arrive.
A lot of the Anglophones who have stayed, they like French. They know French. Their children are going to French schools. I went to French school. My brother went to French school. We are trying to assimilate and integrate. And yet, a lot of the time when you read the newspapers, we're still being blamed for this decline. And I don't get it.
Belonging in Quebec is in my DNA. I've made a sort of a joke, cheek and tongue, tongue in cheek, I should say, that I certainly hope the language police won't come after me and get upset with me in the afterlife because my epitaph will be in English and not in French.
I have mixed feelings. I do. Optimistic because I believe I could make a happy life here. Pessimistic because I think we're heading into some politically stormy periods that are unnecessarily divisive. And while I have plenty of gumption and plan to put my 2 cents in when these discussions arise, I know that it's not always going to be easy.
I'm optimistic in the sense that I have confidence that I will take part in and enjoy taking part in the debates that are to come. And I don't believe that we're going to be entirely destroyed or devastated by the outcome. That's not to say that I don't anticipate it with a certain amount of concern and irritation, I guess.
A lot of the discussions are very draining and get away from some of the issues that people have been raising that have to do more with humanity and bigger issues facing humanity.
Most of the people we interviewed for this documentary had a stronger sense of belonging to their local community and to Canada than to Quebec. The group that had the weakest sense of belonging in Quebec was the second wave that arrived between the Second World War and the FLQ crisis of 1970. The group that arrived after 1995 had the strongest sense of belonging. This is counterintuitive. Why would people who have only been in Quebec a few years feel more at home than families that have lived here for decades and generations? They did not live through the same turmoil, and they were not made to feel like they were the problem. This is a good development, and it offers hope for the future. How strongly do you feel you belong in Quebec? Anglos in Quebec are often portrayed as a pampered and oppressive elite of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Many of them are not Protestants, although they became part of the English-speaking community because they were not Catholic. Most Anglos are not white or Anglo-Saxons. They are from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Even most of the people with direct roots in the British Isles claim to be Celts. And most Anglos are not now, and never were, part of the ruling class. It was a convenient myth during Quebec's decades of self-affirmation to divide the world into tribes of us versus them, and to portray all Anglos as an oppressive elite that needed to be conquered. Lorraine O'Donnell expressed what a lot of Anglos feel.
What I find is it's too, in the media, in history books, there's too often reference only to the wealthy elite, the 1% of the English speakers, as if they represented everyone. I think that's a heavy burden, and it has to go.
And Deborah Ford pinpointed the blind spot created by a culture that sees itself as a victimized minority. In a contest to be the most victimized, there are no winners. We are all losers.
What I do see is a perpetuation of the myth of the Francophone as oppressed in Quebec. I think that one has a lot more, is more problematic in the sense that as long as you're seeing yourself as oppressed, you can't see yourself as the oppressor.
Dominic Cusmano got to the heart of the ongoing friction in Quebec.
There was one segment of Quebec society that wanted to preserve the purity of French, the French language, the French culture. There was another segment that said, no, 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 we want to welcome and accept and integrate and assimilate non-Québécois, non-Francophones.
These competing visions still divide Quebec. One is a yearning to return to a mythical past with a single dominant language and culture. The other vision looks to a future that is diverse, multicultural, and multilingual. The French language will always feel endangered in North America. That is a fact. Quebec is an island surrounded by an ocean that speaks the most powerful and influential language on the planet for business, higher education, tourism, and culture. It is also a fact that if every single English speaker were to leave Quebec tonight, all of those outside forces would still be a problem tomorrow. The Anglos in Quebec have chosen to live here for many reasons. They have worked hard to help create this modern, progressive, peaceful, and prosperous society. They are part of the story, or they should be. We all have our personal memories, but our collective memories determine the official story that is written in history books and taught in schoolrooms. The future depends upon what we, me, you, us, the future depends upon what we choose to remember. All right, so thank you for coming out tonight. As I said, I'm certainly happy to answer questions, but maybe first I'd like to say a couple of things about making the film. I wanted to tell a story representing more than 1 million people. So who do you choose to represent a community so large and so complex? And after thinking about the question for quite a long time, we came up with the idea of waves of immigration, because everybody arrived here at some time. I mean, I can't talk to every single ethnic group, every single religious group, every single political ideology, but everybody arrived at some point in time. So then we tried to find, within those periods, the groups that were mostly the largest groups of immigration during those periods. And this project actually began as a TV series. It was a 6-part TV series. So there were 5 waves of immigration, and then there was a regional episode, because having traveled around Quebec a lot, I knew that the regional episode, I mean, I've known Helena for many years, is really rich and interesting and very poorly known in Montreal. So I thought that that would add a whole other dimension to the project. I wanted to film groups of people so that they could share their collective interests. So they would talk about what it was like for their families arriving during that period of time. But we shot the film between December 2020 and February 2021, which, as you might recall, looking back, was the first winter of the pandemic. There was no vaccine. We did not even know how it was transmitted. And so to bring 10 strangers into a room for 2 hours and ask them to take off their mask was a hard sell. And the people who did that did so because they believed in the project. They believed that this was an important story to tell, and they wanted to be part of it, but I will be forever grateful to them for having done so. So that's what I wanted to say in the beginning. So is there a question here in the audience about the film? Yes, sir.
First of all, I want to say I really like your casting. And after that, how do you find all these speakers?
Thank you. So he's asking how we found the people in the film. And as I've been touring the film around, people have repeatedly said, what an interesting gang and how articulate. Well, as I said, we determined the periods that we wanted for our waves of immigration. And then within each period, we looked at the major groups. So in the first period, obviously English, Irish, Scottish. And then we went through our Rolodexes and found a list of potential people. But we didn't want to have all people the same age or the same sex. We wanted young, old, men, women, all kinds of different backgrounds. And it was a complex, big chart of names, some young, some old women. I mean, some people were perfect, but 2 of them were the same, you know, so we couldn't use them. And if you've ever shot films, as you have actually, you could have somebody who's really interesting in a conversation who freezes when they get in front of a camera. And although I didn't entirely plan it, one of the reasons the project was a success was by having a group. And I had a whole bunch of cameras, so I wasn't interviewing them with a camera in their face. And so they forgot about the cameras, and they were simply talking to one another. And it gave them something really natural and a sort of dynamic between the people in the film, and a very authentic conversation. So after having found a bunch of good people, the format of just having them talk to one another, forget about the cameras, really served the project very well. So thanks for the question. Anybody else have a question? Because as I've also said, I mean, I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm also really interested in hearing about your experiences, you know, why your family came to the Magdalen Islands, why you've stayed here, and how you're feeling about life in Quebec today. So questions about the film, fine, but if somebody wants to tell me a little bit about their own story, I'm happy to hear that too. Come now, you're all amongst friends here, don't be so shy. Come up here and talk.
But anyway, well, I could really resonate with a lot of the stuff that the people on the film said. I grew up here. Both my parents are unilingual Anglophone, so, and in a community that was 95% English, which Charles Taker referred to in the film. So, and at that time we were fairly big population, so I went to school. I had lots of friends. We didn't have to really leave the community for anything. So I didn't feel the need or see the importance of needing to speak French, because we had an English school. We had enough kids to have a group of friends the same age. We did everything in our own language. We only went to town and were really exposed to French when we had to buy groceries or go to the hospital or something like that. So we didn't really, I don't think, see the need to speak French because we were so congregated within our own bubble. But as I got older, I saw the importance of learning French because I wanted to be part of the community here. I wanted to be part of the workforce. I wanted to expand my horizons, and at that point I realized if I wanted to do that, I need to try to pick up some French. So I attempted to go to school different times in French, where I picked up, I guess, the comprehension, and then by being employed by CAMI, and then being in meetings and putting myself out there in, I guess, in opportunities where everything was in French, and then just not being afraid and just started to practice. And eventually I consider myself fluently bilingual, as in I can understand and I can converse. I can't write, I can read, but I still have some improvements. But
well, there's some great software to help with writing.
Oh yeah, DeepL. Use it every day. And I really always had a strong sense of belonging to my local community and to the Magdalen Islands, and never really to the province of Quebec. But I have to say, through the work I've done over the past 20 years, I really do have a strong connection now to Quebec as an English-speaking Quebecer. I do worry about the future of English-speaking Quebec, given the political climate right now. However, I do feel that we have a lot of strong leaders on the ground and in the trenches who are raising awareness with policymakers, with government, with partners, in a way that's not aggressive. You know, it's not the old pen-capped. No, not the no. This is it. It's not angry Anglos anymore. It's more of this is who we are. We want to break the myths, and we want to raise awareness, and we want to know how we can work together, because we do have something to contribute.
Well, thank you. I mean, as I've been traveling around Quebec, that's what I hear everywhere. People have chosen to live in Quebec for all kinds of reasons. And one of the things I wanted to show in the film is how, 50 years ago, it was not uncommon to be unilingual and to live in total isolation. That is extremely rare now. I mean, people learn as much French as they can. Some people have more facility than others, but there's the desire to be part of Quebec. And so, people want that to be reciprocated. And I'm hoping the film will play some role in that regard. I mean, I've just released the subtitled version, and my project for the coming year is to reach as many Francophones as possible to enter into a dialogue. Because when I've shown it to Francophones, the piece about the Catholic schools is not well known. I mean, there was no provincial decree saying that the schools wouldn't accept non-Catholics. As far as anybody can tell, it was not even an official policy of the church. It varied from parish to parish, but it was extremely widespread. And, it was a fatal error on the part of Quebec society in pushing, 2 generations of immigrants into the Protestant/English school system. And it created enormous political problems that we're still trying to untangle. But the first part is to understand what happened, and then sort of to work from that point forward. You have a question? Would you like to come up here and talk into the mic? Or
I just have a question. Oh, yeah, that's right. With Bill 96 and everything going on, while we were doing the film, we didn't know exactly where it was going, and still now it's not clear. But isn't it the same mistake that we are kind of doing again, trying to isolate the newcomer?
That is certainly the general perception. I mean, when I was making the film, Bill 96 had not yet been passed. It hadn't been finalized, which is why I left it kind of vague in the film, although there was a sense that it was going to be important, that whatever was going to happen was going to be as significant as Bill 101. So the point that I've tried to make in the film was the goals of Bill 101 were twofold. One was to equal economic disparities, so that Francophones, even unilingual Francophones, could earn as much as, if not more than, people speaking other languages. That's been more than accomplished. I mean, as the film shows, significantly more than accomplished. The other goal of Bill 101 was to have people speaking French. Now, 95% of people understand French. What does that mean? 95% might be a very high bar, but most people can speak some French. And as you get into younger cohorts, they speak French very well. So many of the goals of Bill 101 were accomplished. And a lot of people felt that we had improved society and we had maintained social peace. Now, Bill 96, originally we thought, like the CAQ wanted to have a political advantage over the Liberals and the Parti Québécois. And that by seizing the identity dossier, they could push the Liberals back onto the backside of the West Island, which they did, that they could steal a lot of votes from the Parti Québécois, which they did. And at that point, we thought that Legault would say, okay, now let's dial it down. We've created a lot of tension. Let's all work together. The fact that he hasn't, that there is not only as much tension, but increasing tension, plus confusion. Because, people don't know Francophones working in the government, if they're allowed to speak English, even if they want to speak English to somebody, will they get in trouble? Anglos don't know if they're allowed to receive services. So it creates uncertainty. And all it takes is one case of somebody being really nasty for the anecdote to spread, and then hostility builds up. And so the short answer to your question is yes. If Bill 96 isn't settled, sorted out, made clear very soon, we're going to have all of the same unpleasant side effects that we had with Bill 101. I'm almost certain, and so are many other people observing the situation, which seems tragic after so much work was done to improve the quality of life and the French language and French culture in Quebec. Yeah. We also have people online who are bringing in questions. So, okay, so you folks out there, if you have a question, send it in, and we will be happy to answer it, all right? So, any other comments about life in Quebec? I mean, I'd be interested in hearing more about life in the Magdalen Islands, because this is a very different region than the rest of Quebec. I mean, I know the Gaspésie fairly well, and I've been up in the North Shore, but this is my first trip here. So, any thoughts about life here?
I'm not from here, but I can share a thought, though. Sure. I'm from La Beauce, which is countryside, and I'm obviously Francophone. But my grandmother was Irish, and coming to this kind of this part of the country, and sorry, I got to move a little bit in. This part of the country, and also Gaspésie and other places around Quebec where I met people from English communities, I found that it was so sad that for us, everybody that has like a name like O'Donnell or whatever like that, in Beauce, they totally lost their background. And my grandmother was Irish, and I totally lost that. And my family is all, actually, I'm from a separatist family. That's the crazy part. My grandmother was Irish, and then all of her children became really separatist. I'm like, what is that?
Well, the Irish didn't have a lot of love for the British.
Oh, that's true. That's true. That may be where it started, but it's a nonsense to me, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to come in this community and other communities where I see that people preserved a sense of their background. That's all.
Well, one thing that's been coming up again and again is the question of whether the future of Quebec is unilingual French, which is kind of where Bill 96 would like to take us. You know, we want everything to be in French, all the services in French. Whereas the reality, I mean, all Anglos now aim to be bilingual. You know, most people learn as much French as they can. When allophones arrive here, in the past they might have assimilated into the majority community, but they don't do that anymore. You know, allophones retain their mother tongue. Most of the kids go to school in French because of Bill 101 and are very proud of that and are very happy to speak in French. But they also learn English because, you know, it's the international language, helps them travel, helps them, you know, follow the media. A friend of mine who's a Francophone journalist was on a French radio show last summer, and the question to the Francophone parents was, would you like your children to be bilingual? So guess what percentage of the Francophone parents said that they wanted their kids to be bilingual?
I'm guessing high because I know a lot of Francophone parents here that wish their children could be bilingual.
High is right. 60. It was like 95%. Yeah. And so, I mean, that is kind of the reality of where we are. If we were to hold a referendum saying, do you want Quebec to be unilingually French, that's it, that's all, or do we want a society that is bilingual, bicultural, multilingual, open on the world, I have no doubt that the vast majority of people would say, let's go. I mean, we want to protect the French language and culture. Yeah, there's no question about that. That's the spirit of Bill 101. People have supported that. But we also want a society that is bilingual or multilingual. So if we could reframe this current debate away from, is French threatened? Because, you know, the CAC has very cleverly phrased this. So if you asked any Francophone in Quebec, is the French language threatened? Is it vulnerable? Of course, the answer is yes. You know, there's a small pool here surrounded by English physically, plus the global presence of the Anglosphere. But then the other half of the equation is, the problem is all of these immigrants. And the immigrants go, well, wait a minute, you know, I went to school in French. That's my working language. Like, why am I a problem? So it's backfiring in that it makes Anglos feel uncomfortable, but also a lot of allophones. And even a certain number of mother tongue francophones who are going, well, I don't have the local accent, so do I belong? So I'm hoping that some government will come to power that sort of reframes this to reflect the will of most of us, which is to respect French as a public language, but also to allow us to thrive in our own languages wherever we want.
Well, to live cohesively.
Yes, to live cohesively. I know it's hard when there's a microphone. It does add a layer of
I'll stand up there, Guy. There's something in here. I'm on the mic because, still learning how to use this stuff. But I moved to Quebec in 2005. I grew up in Ontario. Family was from, my dad's from Belfast, grew up there. Mom's from the UK, blue-collar family. My dad came with his extended family, and I had this uncle and aunt in the Toronto suburbs my whole life. And when I was, after I finished my undergraduate degree, I decided to do my graduate degree at Concordia, and my uncle moved me in his van to Montreal. And that day as we were driving into the city, he said, your Aunt Debbie, his ex-wife, grew up on Monkland in NDG, and they left in the 70s because of all the bombs that were going off in their neighborhood. And I'd never heard of this in Ontario. That was the day I arrived. As I'm driving in, I'm learning about this, and it really made a mark on me. And then the first few months I was in, I actually lived in NDG, and I was terrified to speak English at the store. I thought I didn't even know what an Anglophone was. The word did not exist in my vocabulary. And then more time you spend in Quebec, you start to learn more. And at the local grocery store on Summerled, I was like, why are they all speaking English? Are they tourists? I had no idea, because really English Canada has no idea, for the most part, that there are English speakers in Quebec. We all know this. But that story of these bombings, but my experience in Quebec has been so positive. Like, from the get-go, I was doing my best to learn French on my own, paying for private tutoring, wherever I could get it. I was doing a graduate degree, so I didn't have as much time. Over the years, I definitely became bilingual, but compared to what she lived through with these bombings and this uncertainty, and I've just been welcomed and treated so well, and I've made a career here mostly in English, working for English organizations, but it's been a huge enrichment to learn a second language as an adult, and it's how much things have changed since bombs were going off in this province, to even with the turmoil that always exists. Quebec really amazes me.
Thanks. Well, the fact that people who came here during that Second World War period feel less comfortable in Quebec than people who arrived like you most recently is a reflection of that traumatic period. I mean, I arrived here quite a few decades before Glenn, but when I arrived, I had come from Australia. So my family moved to Australia for a few years. So I pretended I was Australian, even though I was born in Canada. And I wondered why most of the people my age didn't speak very much French, because I didn't understand the bombings and go back to Ontario. They didn't have a great incentive to learn French. But also, if you were born here, if you were from Montreal or from Quebec and you didn't speak excellent French, well, that was looked very badly upon. But if you arrived from somewhere else, like Australia, and you could say bonjour, they loved me. So I was also I could see it. Sitting around a table, as soon as they identified me as a foreigner learning French, they loved me. The guy sitting next to me, born in Montreal, spoke infinitely better French than me, but they didn't give him a break at all. So it's odd how there is that welcoming aspect. So more recent arrivals have not experienced that. They have not heard about all of that tension. And I think we need to put all of that in perspective, because everybody has different experiences, but they all form part of our collective identity. So I would be interested in hearing some more about life in the Magdalen Islands, experience here now or historically, if anybody wants to get up and share a thought. Or you can just say it from your chair and I'll point the mic towards you.
Don't be afraid of the mic. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, sir.
I'll just share something, and because I left, sorry, I left the Magdalen Islands in 1984, and I came back in 2019. And I remember when I left, I came from the Francophone community, and we were all aware there was an Anglophone community somewhere in the Magdalen Islands. But rarely did we mix together. That's my growing up in the 70s and early 80s. I left and I came back, and I see a totally different dynamic with the Anglophone community, whether here in Grosse Ile or on Entry Island. And I like that, and that's what drew me to CAMI, and it's, I think, in large part because of the work CAMI did and the work of my predecessor and their team over the years to improve the relations. So I like that. And my fear is that Bill 96 being not as clear as it should be, or left to interpretation from different organizations, that it might bomb some bridges that took years to build. So that's the fear I have. Maybe so far in the Magdalen Islands, very small populations, very small. Everybody sort of knows each other. I haven't heard of any specific problems, but I'm sure if and when it happens, it'll be quickly out on the street. Everybody will know. But that's basically the fear that I have, is that a lack of clarity may cause some bridges to fall apart.
No, there's already anecdotes. Montreal is a lot more hostile in some ways than the rest of the province. I ran a number of cultural festivals a few years back, and when we were doing them in the Eastern Townships or Hudson or the Laurentians, everybody got on just fine, Anglos, Francos. But in Montreal, you can raise a bit of ire by putting on something that is only in English. So hopefully that doesn't spread throughout the rest of the province. But Bill 96 has certainly not laid down a foundation to facilitate good neighborliness. In fact, I heard a kind of disturbing anecdote of somebody who couldn't speak very good French, trying to get medical services, and she brought in a friend to help translate. And the person on the line said, no, you're not allowed to have a translator. Now, that's an anecdote. But it does kind of reflect the possibility of just not wanting to be kind and generous and offering services. And that could happen, and it already is happening. Yes? Sure.
Even before Bill 96, I know of somebody who was a business owner at the time and who had to contact the CNESST about something. And when he called, he started to speak to the agent in English. The agent continued to respond to him in English, in perfect English, until he realized that he was a business owner. And this was before Bill 96. And he said, I'm really sorry, but I can't speak to you in English because we don't offer services to businesses in English, only to citizens. So he immediately switched over and started speaking French to this unilingual Anglophone, who then says, well, why can't you speak English to me? You were just speaking English to me. So, exactly. It's there's like the policy and the regulation, but then there's also the will of the people that work in those positions. And then when Bill 96 was first tabled, I was in a meeting with the director of the local radio station here, and I said to him, what do you think about Bill 96? He said, what is Bill 96? He was the director of the radio station. He had no idea what it was. And then when I explained it to him and I said, do you think we should talk about it on the radio? He said, no. He said, things are good between the two communities. Don't bring it up. Don't rock the boat. He said, and in another case where I was working with a health professional, and we were talking about one of the programs that the CIS was going to be delivering. And I said to her, does Bill 96 impact this? And she said, well, we got a memo about it, but I just threw it in the garbage. So I think it's really about, it's about individual people and how they want to apply it.
All right, thank you. I'll just mention that even though I like to bring people out for the group screenings, the film is available on YouTube. So for the folks at home, and any of you here, if you have friends or family who might be interested in seeing the film, it's simply the title of the film, whatwechoosetoremember.ca. If any of you folks want a flyer, I have some here. And you folks online, whatwechoosetoremember.ca. Share it with your friends. Thank you for listening tonight.
Well, thank you, Guy. Guy. I got a French moment. Thanks very much. It was very appreciated. I've watched the film. It's my third time, and I've always learned something every time I hear it. So it was very well done. And as you've all recognized, some faces you knew and some pictures you knew, except for Entry Island. I didn't see Entry Island on this. We'll solve that, Candy. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And very informative. And like Guy said, it's available on YouTube. Encourage people you know to view it and to ask questions. Never too late to ask questions about it. So thanks again. Thanks to the crew. Thanks to the RDN shooting teams who are discreetly shooting some shots of the event. And have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
I think I forgot to point out, I mentioned some of the tech team, but I think I may have forgotten Paul doing the projection and the cameras and Lolita helping out on Facebook. So on behalf of QAHN, I want to thank you three for your help tonight, CAMI for the warm welcome, everyone who joined us online, all your comments, everyone in person with their testimonial. It was really beautiful, and I'm so glad we have a record of this. The stream will be saved afterwards, so you can watch it, send it to your friends and family. It'll be available as long as Facebook is. And if not on Facebook, there's a copy on YouTube that's going live there at the same time. So anyways, thank you so much from QAHN, CAMI, and all of you here, and Guy. Thank you.
That's a wrap.
Well done.
My son is in the film industry, so
I'm the interested.